Good evening. My name is David Capes, and I have the privilege of being the Dean of the School of Biblical Theological Studies here at Wheaton College. Tonight at Wheaton College, the stories that shape us. A number of years ago, Walter Brueggemann, one of the most prominent voices in the Old Testament studies and scholarship, said to me, the difference between Jews, Christians, and Muslims is really pretty simple. We tell each other different stories. Jews get together in synagogues and homes and tell a certain set of stories. Christians gather in churches and homes and tell and retell a different set of stories. And then Muslims gather in mosques and homes to share yet another set of stories. And the stories that we tell make all the difference. So tonight we gather to hear some of the stories that have shaped Islam and the world. These stories are written in collections of sacred texts, recorded in history, and enshrined in the stories of people we know and people we don't know. We come together to listen and to seek understanding of one of the world's major religions. From one of the national leaders in interfaith dialogue, Dr. Eboo Patel. In a few minutes, our president, Dr. Philip Ryken, will introduce him. At Wheaton College, it's our habit, it's our way of life to begin a gathering like this in prayer. So I've asked Dr. Aubrey Buster, Assistant Professor of Old Testament, to lead that prayer. Then Dr. Ryken will come and introduce our guest. After Dr. Patel speaks, Dr. Ryken and Eboo, Dr. Patel, will have a conversation. And we'll be privileged to eavesdrop in on that conversation. Dr. Buster.
Thank you. Please pray with me. O Lord, you have created us as image bearers together. Help us tonight in the midst of our struggle for justice and for peace to listen to one another, to seek understanding, and as Jesus commanded, to increase in our love of God and our love of neighbor. May the Lord of peace himself give to us peace at all times and in every way. The Lord be with us tonight. Amen.
It's my privilege to introduce to you my colleague in higher education and friend, Dr. Eboo Patel. I thought it was very appropriate. It was suggested that you would eavesdrop on our conversation because in some ways I think both Dr. Patel and I feel like this is having in public an ongoing conversation that we have had at various conferences over the last 7 or 8 years, in the back of a van or two, in the hallways of conference centers and hotels, just an ongoing conversation about religious liberty, about Christianity and Islam, about higher education, about dialogue between people from different religions. Eboo founded the Interfaith Youth Corps on the idea that religion should be a bridge of cooperation rather than a barrier of division in collaborating on public issues. And what he brings to that bridge building is his own identity as an American, as a Muslim, as someone who has devoted his life to higher education. We are neighbors. Eboo and I both grew up in the Chicago suburbs. We're so pleased to have Dr. Patel's mother here with us tonight. Eboo grew up in nearby Glen Ellen and attended Glenbard South High School. In fact, one of his noted high school teachers is Wheaton alumnus Kurt Tillman, who is also here with us tonight. Dr. Patel went on to the University of Illinois and then was a Rhodes Scholar at the University of Oxford. And he is regarded as really a leader in higher education, particularly for bringing people from different religious faiths and religious traditions for dialogue and, where possible, also for cooperation. If you pay careful attention, you'll see him on the news. You'll see him on television on occasion as really a go-to person for thinking about how do we have a pluralistic society where people of different religions actually can not only coexist but also have neighborly relations in these United States. Eboo spends a lot of his time on the road. speaking at various conventions on many, many college campuses. He's also a published author. I commend to you his book, Acts of Faith, The Story of an American Muslim, The Struggle for the Soul of a Generation. I imagine you'll be sharing a few of these experiences tonight, perhaps. And this is a book I haven't read yet, but I'm starting to feel more guilty about not having read yet. It's working its way up the pile. It's Out of Many Faiths, Religious Diversity and the American Promise. Dr. Patel lives here in the Chicago area with his wife Shanaz and with their 2 sons. And in a moment you will see a video that Dr. Patel thought would be a good introduction to his remarks tonight. And I'm hoping that when that video winds down and you see him making his way to this podium, this lectern, you will give him a very warm Wheaton College welcome. Let's see the video first.
As part of our ongoing Race Matters Solutions series, tonight, special correspondent Charlene Hunter-Gault looks at how lessons from a successful interfaith effort may be used to bridge racial divisions as well.
Finding common ground while respecting differences is what brought these 450 college students and educators together from across the country. They're spending part of their summer vacation at this Chicago hotel, learning how to bridge the toxic divides in our society. The trainers are part of the Interfaith Youth Corps, an organization aimed at helping people of all religions, ethnicities, and beliefs. The nonprofit was founded on the notion that the United States was the first country built on the promise of shared values rather than shared heritages.
Muslim Life Office, they're right next to each other.
And that a 21st century democracy can thrive only if its citizens have the skills to successfully navigate divides of all kinds.
And then you're going to think of all the different groups you're a part of.
Eboo Patel is the founder and president of the organization, the largest of its kind in North America, started in 1998. Patel is Muslim, born in Mumbai, India, and raised in middle-class suburban Chicago. There are chapters on nearly 500 campuses now, focusing on service in the community, pressing issues on campus, and making meaningful cooperation with others a normal part of the college experience in and outside the classroom. Aminata Diallo of Susquehanna University is a student coach who helps jumpstart these sometimes difficult conversations.
So in the training rooms, we are the eyes and ears of the trainers. If there are students who are just like, I'm stuck, I don't have a story, we're the ones to kind of like turn the engine and kind of, you know,
get them going,
thinking, give them some ideas.
During the conference, I sat down with Eboo Patel to ask why, after studying sociology of religion as a Rhodes Scholar, he decided to set out on this challenging path.
I want to go back with you a few years. You had just gotten your PhD at Oxford. You came back to America and you started this program. What caused you to do that?
Mandela, 1999, South Africa. I remember seeing him speak, and he begins by pointing out into the Cape and saying, I spent 27 years of my life on that island in prison, and I wouldn't be on this stage today if it wasn't for the interfaith movement in South Africa that brought down apartheid. And at that time, if you had told me the word interfaith work, I might have kind of rolled my eyes. I didn't realize that people from different faith backgrounds coming together had built this stunning movement in South Africa. And so I thought to myself, you know, going into the 21st century, are we going to forfeit our societies to religious extremists, or are we going to try to build an interfaith movement that helps all of us build diverse democracies where everyone can thrive? And I thought to myself, I want to be a part of the next chapter of history. So many powerful interfaith movements have been about articulating, reconciling language that undoes racism and that builds new societies.
Thank you so much. You know, there's a great line in the work of the Catholic philosopher Alistair MacIntyre at Notre Dame University. He says, I cannot tell you what I am going to do until I first tell you the story or stories of which I am a part. And one of the striking things for me in being in South Africa, in Cape Town in 1999 at the turn of the millennium, and watching Mandela give that talk and point out into the Cape and speak of the interfaith movement that freed South Africa, was I realized, I wonder what kind of a role this work has played in my society. And so I come back home to the United States after finishing my doctoral work at Oxford, and I start reading and listening to American history with the eyes and the ears of interfaith cooperation. And what I find is that this nation is really the world's first attempt at religiously diverse democracy. There's a great insight in the book, What It Means to Be an American, by the political philosopher Michael Walzer. Walzer says that for centuries, political philosophers believed that to have a diverse democracy was impossible. If you wanted diversity, it had to be under a dictatorship, somebody who would squelch identity. If you wanted democracy, you had to have homogeneity. Full stop, next paragraph. It begins with this line, until the United States of America. Amongst the many things that our founders attempted, perhaps the most important was the idea of a religiously diverse democracy. So, when George Washington receives a letter from Moses Sessions, the leader of the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, a Jewish community in the new United States of America in the late 18th century, Sessions congratulates Washington on receiving the presidency and the ratification of the Constitution, and then he gets down to business and he says, what's going to happen to my people? We who have been hated and hounded and harassed in Europe for centuries, what will become of us? And Washington writes back in one of the great documents in U.S. history, the letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, my government will give to bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance. May the children of the stock of Abraham sit in safety under their own vine and fig, and let there be none to make them afraid. He goes on to say at the end of the letter, may the Lord of all mercies scatter light and not darkness, make us happy in our own unique ways, and make us useful in our own unique ways, and happy in his everlasting manner. That's the big idea of the United States from its founding. And it wasn't just Washington. The first iftar to be celebrated in the White House, iftar is the meal that ends the fasting during the month of Ramadan, the sun up to sundown fasting, was not hosted by Barack Obama, although he hosted them, was not hosted by George W. Bush, although he hosted them also, not by Bill Clinton, although he started the modern tradition of the hosting of iftars. It was hosted in the early 19th century by Thomas Jefferson. Benjamin Franklin gave a donation to the building fund of every religious community in the Philadelphia area, saying to all of them, I want all of you to flourish and come together to celebrate the nation on July 4th. And because there was no Muslim community in Philadelphia at the time, he built a hall. He said the pulpit of this hall will be open to a preacher of any persuasion. If the Grand Mufti of Constantinople wants to send a Muslim preacher here, this pulpit is at his service. This is the attempt, the experiment of American democracy since its beginning. Actually, that idea emerges a century and a half before the founding era. In the middle of the 17th century, Peter Stuyvesant, the Governor General of New Amsterdam, now New York City, decides to ban Quaker prayer meetings, calls Quakers rabble-rousers, seducers of the people. Has anybody here ever been to a Quaker prayer meeting? They don't talk. I used to go at Oxford on Sunday mornings sometimes, and I was like, y'all aren't really rabble-rousing too well here. In any case, banned them. And in most eras, in most nations and societies, that would have been the end of it. Another religious community excluded. But there was something, I would like to think, in the soil here, something in the air, there was a group of people in the little hamlet of Flushing, now, of course, in the borough of Queens, maybe the most religiously diverse neighborhood in the world, that decides this is not okay. And they write this beautiful document called the Flushing Remonstrance, where they say things like, the law of peace, love, and liberty extends to all Baptists, Quakers, Turks, Egyptians, because they are all sons of Adam. Articulates it in Christian language, delivers it to Peter Stuyvesant in person, and for their troubles, some get banished and some get thrown in jail. And part of what strikes me of all of this is none of them at the time are Quaker. This is all a part of the story of America. And it's a modern story as well. One of the stories that I love to tell is the story of how we come to think of ourselves as a Judeo-Christian nation. One of the jokes I often offer is that the Mayflower Pilgrims, when they landed on the eastern seaboard and dusted off Plymouth Rock, saw those words etched in the stone, Judeo-Christian nation. Right? Or maybe the pioneers heading west looked up and God had written it in the sky or scratched it somewhere in the Midwest. Right? So of course everybody knows these are my half-hearted attempts at jokes. But think about it for a second. If that's not where the term Judeo-Christian nation comes from, where does it come from? Everything has a history, right? So here's the interesting history of the word Judeo-Christian nation. The 1920s, along with being the era of jazz and the flappers, is also the era of the KKK. 3 to 4 million members, many of them here in the Midwest, terrorizing blacks, Catholics, and Jews. And one of the great victories of the KKK happens in 1928, around the campaign for president of a man named Al Smith. He was the governor of New York, but really, more remarkably, he was a Catholic, the first Catholic to run for president on a major party ticket. And the KKK and other anti-Catholic forces at the time said things like, if Al Smith wins, he's going to send the Pope a one-word telegram, unpack. Al Smith opened a tunnel to Manhattan, I think it was the Lincoln Tunnel, so that he could sneak the Pope in faster. Anti-Catholic trope after anti-Catholic trope. And you know what? They won. Al Smith's candidacy went up in flames, lost by a landslide. And a group of what I call interfaith leaders, naming themselves the National Conference for Christians and Jews, pastors and rabbis and priests, decide we can't have this. In a nation that was founded the way ours was founded, with the grand visions of Washington and Jefferson and Franklin and Madison and Adams, in a nation that counts amongst its documents the lines of the great Baptist Roger Williams, the Flushing Remonstrance, in a nation in which Abraham Lincoln said to people at a July 4th celebration in Chicago in 1858, some of you trace your lineage back to the founders, those iron men. Some, their genealogy goes back even further to those who came off the Mayflower. But others of you here, I want you to know that if you hold with the words of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, you are blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the men who wrote those words, so let it be so. We come from this nation, the NCCJ said, and we cannot now allow it to lock out the contributions of Jews and Catholics. So they start this interfaith organization. They send pastors, priests, and rabbis to communities all across the country, and as it's the gear up for World War II, to military bases around the world, 772 visits to military bases. They call these trialogues. They discuss the common ground in theology and civil society amongst Protestantism, Catholicism, and Judaism. And along the way, in parallel to these civic initiatives, They offer a new imagination, a new narrative, a new story for what had long been a Protestant nation. So Protestant that great liberal lion Franklin Roosevelt said, this is a Protestant country and the Jews and Catholics are here under sufferance. And that word that they made up, invented, was Judeo-Christian. Wasn't handed by God to Moses on Sinai. Wasn't whispered by Jesus in Jerusalem. Wasn't found on Plymouth Rock or in the sky. It was invented. Think about it. Is Judeo-Christian really that theologically accurate? I'm in a place that I respect greatly, where Jesus plays the central role, Lord and Savior, Son of the living God, in your faith life. Ask your Jewish friends about the role that Jesus plays in their faith life. He was a good rabbi, maybe. Discuss. The term Judeo-Christian is not especially theologically accurate. And as far as history goes, it's not like Jews fared especially well in majority Christian societies for much of human, especially Western history. This is not to cast aspersions. The audience all of a sudden went very somber. This is to celebrate America's genius. When we needed a new chapter that welcomed in relatively new minority religious communities, we wrote that chapter. So, what comes next? Now that we live in a nation where there are almost as many Buddhists and Muslims as ELCA Lutherans, Methodists, and Jews. Now that scholars call us the most religiously diverse nation in human history. Judeo-Christian did great work for 80 years. It is a part of the American story. I would much rather be a Jew in America in 1960 than in 1930. And as far as Catholics go, I remember standing on the south lawn of the White House in fall of 2015 with my wife, watching a black president introduce the Pope with a bunch of Vatican flags flying in Washington, D.C. And I thought to myself, somebody wake up Norman Vincent Peale from the grave and tell him that his nightmare just came true. But you know what? Nobody was tripping out because we had become absorbed into the fiber of our bones the idea that we were a Judeo-Christian nation. Great insight by Roland Barthes, the great French scholar. He said, "A myth is a story that has become so deeply woven into a nation's culture that the people forget that at one point somebody wrote it." And again, all of this is a celebration. When America needs to expand, it expands. When America needs to write another chapter, it writes another chapter. One that is continuous with the best of its tradition and that stretches into the frontiers of the needs of the new age. One of the people who wrote one of those chapters was, of course, one of Mandela's heroes. My favorite image of this particular American is as a seminary student, 1950. Crozier Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. He hears that a great black scholar, Mordecai Johnson, the president of Howard University, is giving a talk on Christian love at Friendship House in Philadelphia. Takes the train, sits in the back of the audience, cold spring day, maybe 21 years old. And Martin Luther King Jr., Daddy was a Baptist preacher, Granddaddy was a Baptist preacher, great-granddaddy was a Baptist preacher. He's on his way to the pulpit himself. He listens to Mordecai Johnson say that the greatest Christian, the most Christ-like person of the 20th century is a Hindu from India. And honestly, I wouldn't have blamed young Martin Luther King Jr. from just standing up and turning around and walking out. This is not what he came for. But King doesn't do that, of course. King instead asks himself the question, what is it that the example of Gandhi can teach me? How does Gandhi's reading of the Bhagavad Gita, the great Hindu text, cast new light on my reading of the Bible? This happens especially around the ethic of nonviolence, which King himself says in his autobiography he had long understood as something you do between friends and family members. But as far as how you run a nation or a social reform movement, I mean, there are earthly compromises you have to make, right? Gandhi didn't make those compromises. It was his Hindu faith that he understands through the Jain concept of ahimsa, love and respect for all life, that he mobilizes into a movement that he calls satyagraha, love force or peace force, the force that removes the British colonists from India. I have this image of King back at Crozier in the library. There's a half dozen books on Gandhi on his left, half dozen books from the Christian tradition on his right, Niebuhr and Tillich, Rauschenbusch and the Bible, and he's reading across these traditions, and he's becoming a better Christian. One of my favorite examples of that is a decade later. This is after the Montgomery bus boycott, after King has become a national star. He wants to see the legacy of Gandhi Satyagraha movement in India with his own eyes. So he travels there. The Mahatma has been dead for a decade, assassinated. King would, of course, face that same martyrdom a decade later. But what King is most moved by is that Gandhi's Hindu-based movement is not just for Hindus. The Christian love movement that King led in Montgomery was basically just Christians. But Gandhi, he had somehow been able to involve Muslims and Jains and Buddhists and secular humanists like Jawaharlal Nehru and Sikhs, this whole panoply of Indian religion. King comes back to his pulpit, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, Montgomery, Alabama, small provincial city in the American South, Palm Sunday, 1959. Here's the second to last line of his sermon. "O God, our gracious Heavenly Father, we call you this name. We know some call you Brahma. We know some call you Allah. We know some call you Elohim. We know some call you the unmoved mover." And here's the last line of King's Palm Sunday sermon, 1959. "Who will come to the front of the church and take the Christ as their Lord and Savior, just as you are?" There's nothing in King's appreciation for Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, the multiple ways that other people call God, the insights of the Bhagavad Gita and the Quran. There's nothing in that that cuts off his roots as a Christian. Those Baptist roots go very, very deep. Who will come to the front of the church and take the Christ, the Son of the living God, just as you are? Somehow, here's a person who could expand his interfaith wings and deepen his religious roots. I think that that's part of the genius of interfaith cooperation. And just as every single one of these American stories, how we became a Judeo-Christian nation, how the founders imagined a religiously diverse democracy, how Martin Luther King Jr. leads an interfaith civil rights movement, one that brings me to this country. Why? Because the immigration legislation that removes racism from American immigration, 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act to 1965, Racism is a cornerstone of American immigration. In 1965, that gets removed in the Immigration and Naturalization Act. It is not coincidental that it happens right smack dab in the middle of the civil rights movement. It was black people who fought, bled, and died in the streets of this country that opened up the doors of immigration to people from all around the world. So I owe that man something, more than something. I owe that movement something. At the very least, I owe this nation my best contribution. What other set of stories might shape us in addition to a set of national stories? Well, for you and for me, it would be a set of religious stories. And one of the things I love about religion is that you don't get more epic than faith. So we might as well begin from the beginning. I remember in my own movement back to Islam as a young adult, it's part of my PhD studies at Oxford University. I'm not smart enough to learn other languages and stuff, so I'm doing an ethnography on Ismaili Muslims in London, but I'm reading the Quran and other scholarship on Islam as a way to deepen my own faith, a way to get context. And I'm in the middle of Surah 2, chapter 2 of the Holy Quran. And it's one of those dark, cold Oxford nights. And I read this set of verses, and it has me sit up straight. The way that God creates Adam is he picks up a lump of clay and he gives it his ruh, or his breath. And he says to Adam, "You are my vicegerent, my deputy on earth. It is your charge to steward creation." And he calls the angels forth. And he says to the angels, "I want you to honor Adam, who I have made my deputy." And the angels respond, "Why would we honor a creature who will only fiddle and destroy, who will shed blood and sow discord?" God says, "I know what you do not know." God vouches for Adam, for us, our ancestor, in the face of the angels. And he says to the angels, "I'm going to set up a contest. I want you to tell me the names of creation." And the angels respond, "Oh God, we don't know of creation. The only knowledge we have is to sing the glories of your exalted name." God turns to Adam. He says, "You tell me the names." And Adam can do it. Adam, our common ancestors, the first human being, the one created by clay and God's breath, has the ability to name the names of creation, a piece of knowledge that the angels do not have. And I'm reading this passage, and there's one word in it that's jumping out at me, and it's the word names. And the thing that strikes me is that it's not singular. It's not name. The command does not tell me the name of creation. It's tell me the names, plural, names. Creation is not a monoculture. It's not the same thing over and over and over again. Creation is diverse. The distinctive gift that we have, what God bestows upon us, invests in us, such that he deputizes us to be his vicegerent, such that he vouches for us in the face of the angels' denial, is our ability to flow with diversity, to call out its names. It is a theme that the Quran and the Muslim tradition repeat over and over and over again. Surah 49, "We created you diverse nations and tribes that you may come to know one another." God to the Prophet Muhammad, "We sent you to be nothing but a special mercy upon all the worlds, not upon the Arabs, not upon the Muslims, upon all the worlds." There is a specifically interfaith quality to this, which I think is best exemplified by the Sunnah, the stories of the Prophet Muhammad. One of the most momentous moments in the life of the Prophet occurs in the year 610 during one of the odd nights of the last 10 days of the month of Ramadan in that year. The month of Ramadan is, of course, the month of fasting and of almsgiving and of special devotion to God. And the Prophet Muhammad, even before prophethood, before this moment of first revelation, would leave the city of Mecca, go to the cave of Mount Hira, and pray and put aside his charity and devote himself to God. And one night, one of those odd nights, one of the last 10 days, he feels gripped by a force. And the force says, Iqra, recite. And Muhammad says, I am not a reciter. He's a merchant. I'm not a reciter. I'm illiterate. Second time, the force grips him. Iqra, recite. I am not a reciter. Third time, he feels like the life is being squeezed out of him. Iqra, recite. And this time, the first words of what becomes the Holy Quran comes pouring from his mouth. Recite in the name of your Lord who created. So there are traditions that say that Muhammad was scared. He thought that maybe he had been possessed by a jinn, one of the demon-like figures in Western Arabia at the time. He goes back to the person he trusts and loves and respects most in the world, his wife, tells her the story, shivers in her lap, says, what's happened? Khadija says, I can't tell you exactly what just took place, but I know for sure that God has not forsaken you. He would not let you be possessed. You are Al-Amin. You are the righteous man. Too loving of God for him to forsake you. But I do know someone who may be able to tell us what happened. My cousin, Waraka. Waraka, who is learned in the scriptures. Khadija bundles her husband up, takes him to Waraka, tells the story to this wizened old man dressed in his robes in the center of Mecca. Waraka looks Muhammad in the eye, kisses him on the forehead, and says, verily, the prophet of your people has arrived. Who is Waraka? What does it mean to be learned in the scriptures in the early part of the 7th century in the western half of the Arabian Peninsula? Waraka's a Christian. He's a Christian monk. He's recognizing the flowering of a different religious civilization in his midst. He's kissing it on the forehead. He doesn't convert to Islam. The prophet doesn't ask him to. Just a sense of something new and cosmic and beautiful is happening. I am who I am. I will respect you for who you are. The first person to recognize the prophethood of Muhammad is a Christian monk. It would not be Muhammad's last positive encounter with Christians. During his mission between the years 610 and 632, he's hated and hounded and harassed, like lots of prophets are on their land. And at one point, he fears being eliminated, that the Muslims would just be wiped out because certain tribes in the Quraysh were especially aggressive against these people who were preaching principally monotheism and mercy. So he sends a contingent of the Muslims, led by his own family member Ja'far, to a place called Abyssinia, present-day Ethiopia. Why Abyssinia? Well, Abyssinia is ruled by a man named the Negus. The Negus is a Christian. The Prophet Muhammad feels sure that a kindred religious civilization would respect, welcome, and protect this fledgling new religion of Islam. One of the Quraysh goes to Abyssinia, whispers in the ear of the Negus that there are mischief makers called Muslims in his land. So the Negus gathers his court and his bishops, forces the Muslims to come and explain themselves. Jaffer recites from the verses of the Quran that speak of the virginity of Mary. Sources tell us that the Negus is so moved by the beauty of these verses, by the intersection of these faith traditions on this particular matter of belief, he weeps so copiously that his beard is soaked with his tears, his bishop's the same. He stands, he picks up his staff, he draws a line in the sand and says, the difference between your religion and mine is no thicker than this line in the sand. You will always be safe here. When a group of Christians from the city of Najran come to Medina to argue theology with the prophet, to argue about the different views of Jesus, not a small dispute. And it comes time for them to pray, and they ask the prophet if they may have leave of the city so they could go outside of the boundary of Medina to offer their prayers and come back and resume the debate. The prophet says, no, you will pray in my mosque. But how? As we believe so differently on the nature of Jesus. What is it about a theological dispute that would prevent me from offering you hospitality? The prophet responds. So if I am shaped by these stories of America, again, from the Flushing Remonstrance to the founding, from Lincoln's electric cord speech in Chicago in 1858 to King's spiritual role in helping usher in the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, I am equally shaped by these stories in Islam. The story of believing that diversity is holy. God makes creation that way on purpose, makes human beings our way so that we may flow with and name that diversity, shapes the Prophet Muhammad's story so that he has this series of positive, loving, respectful, mutually protective, and hospitable stories with Christians. The question then becomes, what's next? There's this great line in the work of the poet T.S. Eliot. We do not inherit traditions. We work to make ourselves worthy of them. So I guess that video, the organization that I started, that's my contribution. My little way of trying to be what the Quran says is a special mercy upon all the worlds. In the most religiously diverse nation in human history, at a time when a whole bunch of people are committed to faith as a bludgeon of domination or a barrier of division, I would like it to be a bridge of cooperation. I think the alternative is much uglier. And one of the things that I would ask you, especially the students here, is what do you do with this inheritance that is America as an interfaith nation? The Quakers excluded in the 1650s, and the authors of the Flushing Remonstrance who said, nope, not here. Our beloved community includes them. Right? Washington standing up for Moses Sessions, Jefferson hosting an iftar, Franklin building a hall saying, this pulpit is at the service of a Muslim preacher. Where does this all go for you in the early 21st century? I'll leave you with the scene and a question. So, a couple years ago, I'm getting a tour of the Greater Chicago Food Depository. Anybody ever been in one of these buildings, a food depository? I imagine a bunch of you have volunteered there. In some ways, you think to yourself, like, wow, this is so inspiring, right? I mean, like, look at all this effort. It's like a football field's worth of food. It's piled like a story or two high, right? All this effort that goes into feeding hungry people. And then you think to yourself, still in America, hungry people? It's a really interesting mind bend to be in one of these places. In any cases, I'm there and I'm getting a tour. And And finally, I stop and I say to the CEO and the senior vice president, I'm like, this is great. It's like it's an interesting field trip for me, but y'all are busy people. Why am I here? Why are you spending all this time? And they said, we have this really interesting challenge and opportunity. So here's one of the things that we discovered about the Greater Chicago Food Depository in an audit that we did of our programs and services. We have 650 distribution sites around the Chicagoland area. 2/3 of them are diverse faith communities. My mom's friend Asra is nodding her head because she's like, in my masjid, there's one of those. Right? 2/3 of them. Jain temples, Hindu temples, synagogues, churches, gurdwaras, masjids, sanghas, diverse faith communities, right? Of course, that just makes perfect sense, right? Nobody here is surprised by that, but it's still interesting. 2/3 of the places where people come to pick up grocery bags full of foods, people who would otherwise not eat, are doing it by people who say in various languages, bless you, Khudafis, God be your guardian. 2/3 of the volunteers at the Greater Chicago Food Depository are faith groups, diverse faith groups. Synagogue, Jain group, there's a Hindu group, there's a Baha'i group, a couple of evangelical groups, Catholic group, Muslim group. There's like, accommodate 6 or 7 groups at a time. Y'all have been there, right? A bunch of you have been there, You go in with like your lime green t-shirts and stuff. I see y'all like at O'Hare heading out to Ephesus or something, your mission trips. I've seen those shirts. So like imagine there's like 8 groups of y'all on a Sunday afternoon. And same format, each one of the 8 aisles at the Greater Chicago Food Depository. Begin with a moment of silence and a prayer. You do your hour of packing grocery bags or boxes, and then there's a scripture reading and a discussion about how you connect your faith to that service, right? So right next to your aisle, there's a Hindu group doing that. And right next to them, there's a Muslim group. And right next to them, there's a Catholic group. And right next to them, there's a Jewish group. And at the Greater Chicago, there's like a balcony up top at the food depot where you can like watch these groups go through the same format together, all got different colored t-shirts. They walk out because it's regimented volunteer hours and they give each other one of these. Nice to see you. So, CEO and the senior vice president say to me, we keep on thinking to ourselves, there's so much more we could do. What about interfaith volunteer opportunities? Our most effective lobby day in Springfield is church day. We bring buses full of Christians to Springfield to lobby on behalf of hunger and homelessness, on behalf of solving hunger and homelessness. And the Jews do this, there's a synagogue day, and Muslims now do this. What if we had an interfaith day in Springfield? Our most effective PSAs, pastors on the radio. Every once in a while we'll get a rabbi or an imam. What if we had interfaith PSAs? How inspiring would that be? And then we started thinking to ourselves, man, this is dangerous. Because what if we have Interfaith Day in Springfield and there are theological disputes that break out on the buses on the way down, and people are like, we don't want to do this anymore. What do you have an interfaith PSA and people start discussing the politics of the Middle East? We don't want to do this anymore. So how do we maximize for the opportunity, realize the beauty, the power, the multiplication of social capital, the strengthening of the civic fabric through interfaith efforts at the food depository, but how do we minimize the dangers? And I thought to myself, you need a person. Like you need an interfaith leader. You need somebody who has the vision, the knowledge base, and the skill sets to be able to shape discussions in a way that tend towards the inspiring commonality and away from the division, that can be increasingly sophisticated in their theology, recognizing there are theological disputes that we will always have because we are, after all, different religious communities, that can reach out to even more religious communities than you have here. You need an interfaith leader. So here's my question. Is that you? That's a job description. That's every food depository in America. They need an interfaith leader. Is that you? Good teacher leaves them with a question.
Thank you, Eboo. You've given us so many things to talk about, which is great. I'm just going to say we're going to go until about 8:27, and then David Capes is going to come up for some final comments, and we're going to talk about as many things as we have an opportunity to. Let me just start in this place. So one of the things that's interesting to me about our friendship is we've lived kind of parallel lives in the Chicago suburbs, and had some of the same educational opportunities or similar ones. I mean, I was interested to see a picture of you with your folks outside the Sheldonian Theater in Oxford. I've got a photo like that with my folks, probably 20 feet away from there, which also makes some of the differences between our experiences really stand out for me. And you told us some of the stories of America from a certain perspective. You also told us some stories from Islam. Just tell us one or two personal stories of your sort of upbringing that created in you a recognition for a need of cooperation across religions, or that were kind of transformational for you to see that you had a calling and an appetite for this kind of work. What are one or two of those stories, high school or college, for you?
Sure. So, my mom is here, which I'm so proud about. And so many of these stories kind of happen under color of her ethos. So I'm at Glenbard South High School, where Mr. Tillman, who I still call Mr. Tillman because that's how I was raised, my best friends were a Nigerian evangelical, a South Indian Hindu, a Cuban Jew, a Mormon, a Lutheran, and a Catholic. Right?
There's no punchline.
There's
no
punchline.
No.
Right? It's late 20th century America, and it's even more common in early 21st century America. And what's interesting is that I didn't realize it at the time. I mean, frankly, back then we were just the nerds, right? Like we weren't like this religiously diverse group of kids. It was going to become chapter 2 of my first book, right? Back then we were just the nerds. But when I think about it in retrospect, I realize that religion plays a role in the backgrounds of most of our lives in some way, shape, or form. It kind of gets into our bones in a way, right? And particularly my Mormon friend, who was also my girlfriend at the time, she is especially explicit about it, that her faith plays a key role in her goodness, right? And while, that's not a door that I would walk through for some years, she's the one who opened it for me. That this notion that a religious commitment is key to one's goodness in the world. And so I just think that I grew up comfortable with different religions, with parents, especially a mom who's a very deeply committed Ismaili Muslim, and for whom respect, love, appreciation for other religious traditions is just a way of life. And I mean, one of the examples I have about this is, every few months, one of my hippie white friends would become a vegetarian, right? And they'd come for dinner, and my mom would be like, just have them eat the chicken, right? Like, in 3 months, it's going to be a different fad. But if one of my Hindu friends came over, my mother was very committed to them being able to eat, right, vegetarian food, right? So there was a sense of we are going to accommodate your religious identity out of a sense of deep reverence, right? And I think that that's woven into my parents' lives. My parents go to Catholic schools in India. My dad comes here to Notre Dame. There's the sense that other people's religious commitments are to be respected and revered, and we have our own.
So one of the things that really interested me about your work very early on was recognizing that the work of the Interfaith Youth Corps and how you approach issues of religious dialogue, whatever your religious convictions are, you don't have to check those at the door. So I hear a lot about interfaith dialogue where kind of the goal is, let's pretend we don't disagree about things that we actually do disagree about. And that's not the approach you take. I mean, I think it was well expressed in the PBS at the beginning, finding common ground while respecting differences, or even your example of the this Abyssinian leader who is recognizing with respect these Muslims that are in his country. There's a line in the sand, and he doesn't rub out the line and pretend that the line isn't there. And I'm interested in why it's important to you, just personally or from your Muslim convictions, that we actually get to retain our religious convictions and we bring those to the dialogue that we have, and we actually agree that we actually are going to disagree about things. Why is that important for you?
I mean, for me, that's like, it is such a first principle that I don't know how to explain it, right? What else is religious diversity in part but differences between religions? What you know, like every once in a while, I'll run into somebody who, a college student who'll go to an interfaith gathering and they'll come back and they'll look at me aghast and they'll be like, some of the people had different ideas of God than me. I'm like, what did you think you were going to? Right? Like, what, really? Like, this is, if you're in the soup, you're going to get wet. If you deal with religious diversity, you're going to deal with different views on matters of ultimate concern. I think the interesting question is, what do we choose to emphasize, right? And in the story of Ja'far and the Negus in Abyssinia, he chooses to emphasize the verses of the Quran about the virginity of Mary. He doesn't lead with the different Muslim view of Jesus. It's not that Muslims don't have a different view. It's just the question of, what do you choose to lead with in a particular moment? So I think that, you know, this is the way I think about interfaith work in a very practical way. Of course there are differences and disagreements. Of course some of those differences are not going to be differences that you like. Of course some of those disagreements are going to be unbridgeable, and choose to lead with the inspiring commonality. Right, so I think that there's kind of a sila of and Charbitis of this. You know, the sila of our differences are so gargantuan we can never get around them, and the Charbitis of you wash your hands before you pray, I wash my hands before I pray. We're all the same, right? So I think that the middle path through that is recognize the deep differences and choose to lead with the inspiring commonality.
So there are some interfaith efforts that do more rubbing out of those lines and trying to only talk about the commonalities. What is your sort of critique or response or rejoinder to people that argue for that kind of interfaith dialogue? Or you know, another example is perhaps interfaith worship, where actually, despite fundamental differences in the nature of God and the massive things that you were talking about that we disagree about, people actually think, no, we can just set all that aside and worship together. What would be your sort of critique or rejoinder to that approach? Why the approach that you're taking with Interfaith Youth Corps is to be preferred, or is better for democracy, or what would be your sort of response?
So the way we think about interfaith work at IFYC is, what are areas in our civic life, in the life that you just lead naturally, right? In hospitals, athletic arenas, public schools, service opportunities like the food depository, grocery stores, etc. Those areas in which you are likely to encounter diverse religious identities, what are some interesting ways that those diverse religious identities might play out in those areas, and how would you realize the opportunity and minimize the challenge. So the food depository example is a great example of this, I think, right? You want to volunteer at the food depository? Like, other people want to volunteer at the food depository. Is there an opportunity? Is there good that can be done by volunteering together and not only expanding the circle of volunteerism, but using that as an opportunity to share a part of one's faith that is readily shareable and easily understandable, and de-emphasizing dimensions that are likely to cause disputes in that moment, right? So that kind of civic dimension, I think, is really important. Why do I say that? It's because it's not my goal to tell you to go out looking for an interfaith dialogue. It's my goal to tell you, look around at this most remarkable religiously diverse nation, realize that if you're a classroom teacher and if you have Muslim students, there is some chance they will be fasting during the month of Ramadan. And if you want to be a good educator in that situation, you will figure out how to make reasonable accommodations for that. And you will think about it ahead of time. And if you're a Christian, your Christian identity may well play some role in your neighborliness in that environment.
So let's talk a little bit more about this area of religious liberty, because I think of all the areas where there's a lot of room for cooperation, it's in our defense and promotion of religious liberty. I was just at the meeting of the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities, a distinctively evangelical group of 140 colleges and universities around the country. That's a group you know, because you've spoken to our group and you've got relationships with a lot of those college presidents. And we had a panel just this last time with Kevin Worthen from Brigham Young University, with the president of Yeshiva University, with the president of the Muslim University, which I think is out in California. It's this religiously diverse panel talking about some of these religious liberty issues. And one of the things that was striking to me when I was thinking through issues of religious liberty that affect Wheaton College is I was in England. I was at Salisbury Cathedral, where they have one of the original copies of the Magna Carta. The first principle of the Magna Carta is religious liberty. And there are reasons why Christians who have been thoughtful and I think biblically wise about religious liberty have recognized the freedom of the individual conscience before God, and have said that actually what is in our Constitution in terms of First Amendment freedoms, that's deeply Christian. I'm interested in what are the resources, and you've touched on some of them already, I think, but what are some of the resources for you as a Muslim? Why are you committed as a Muslim to religious liberty, not just as an American, but also as a Muslim?
Yeah. I mean, so the most straightforward one from the Quran is there is no compulsion in religion, right? And there's also plenty of chapters in Muslim history where the sense of within majority Muslim societies with Muslim rulers, other religious communities have freedom to practice their faith. Now, there's kind of you can't compare 11th century Cairo with 21st century Chicago in terms of the details of it. But in Fatimid Cairo, there was a respect and freedom for Jews, respect and freedom for Christians, et cetera, et cetera. So in my mind, in kind of the most glorious chapters of Muslim history, this is practiced in kind of in a way that was reasonable for the times, and there are Quranic principles around this. I think the most interesting thing about religious liberty is that that's the fountainhead for religious diversity. The reason that we have religious diversity is based on the principle of religious liberty. So I think fighting for that principle makes very, very good sense, and it's threatened in a variety of ways. But I guess I am most interested in how do we train doctors so that when they practice in religiously diverse hospitals, they recognize that different religious traditions have different definitions of death, right? And I guess I think that this is temperamentally the case for me. I am not a fighter. Like, I don't, other people should fight for religious liberty. I am not temperamentally suited to go out with placards and go fight for something. even however important that is. I think that our diverse and interwoven civic fabric in America is a little like William Carlos Williams' Red Wheelbarrow. So much depends on it, and we don't know how important it is because we are accustomed to it. We just think it's going to be there forever, and I think it's under threat right now.
Let's just talk about that a little bit. So I agree that it's under threat, and I think that's important to you in the work that you do, because unless people value religious liberty, there's not going to be a context in which we can have those dialogues, or in appropriate ways that are appropriate to our own conviction, can find places where we can cooperate for the common good. One thing that occurs to me is that people oftentimes in our culture, I think of religious liberty as something that is only for religious people, as if there are religious people and there are secular people. And religious liberty is kind of a special liberty only for the religious people. So that's a problem. What are some of the other areas where you see religious liberty under threat?
I'm about to put the finishing touches on a piece for this for Inside Higher Education, but basically identity politics on the progressive end is principally about race, gender, and sexuality. Identity politics on the conservative end is principally about religious liberty. And this doesn't mean, I don't mean this in substance, I mean this in symbol, right? I am concerned about ways that different factions taking seriously different dimensions of identity and their extrapolations from those dimensions of identity serve to tear apart the civic fabric. Right, so that is not an argument against the defense of religious liberty. It is the asking of a question: are there important things that we can do together? I get concerned, when I see, not because I don't think it's important, right? But when I see, I happen to be at BYU the day that President Wheaton was with you guys, which is why he wasn't at I gave the Evans Lecture for Religious Understanding at BYU last week, and I read in Religion News Service about Sheikh Hamza, who's a friend and mentor of mine, saying, we religious people need universities where you can be devotional and feel safe, right? And on the one hand, I understand that, and on the other hand, I think to myself, I'm not interested. I don't want to conjure up a non-religious group of people who I think is dangerous. I don't want to. There's stories about European map makers in the Middle Ages who put Europe at the center and draw everywhere else. Here be monsters. I don't want to do that, right? I don't want to carry a flag, knowing that me carrying that flag is going to provoke you into carrying a different flag. So, which is one of the reasons I am skeptical in ways that make my friends unhappy about progressive identity politics, because it is currently a flag that is provoking another group of people to carry a different flag. And I wonder if you see, if I may ask you a question, if you see...
Hey, I'm doing the interview here. Come on.
You told me to ask you.
What is this, a conversation? So,
if you see the manner, by which I do not mean substance, but the style in which religious liberty is making its way in American discourse as part of the danger of a nation under two flags.
Yeah, so one thing, this is a little bit of a weird conversation, because usually when we're talking, you've got a lot of questions for me about how evangelicals think, so it's a little bit weird for us to have more of a one-sided conversation. I'm not sure if this is exactly answering the question, but what I would say is that by and large, many evangelicals have taken religious liberty simply for granted and just assumed that that's kind of normative for American culture. And all of a sudden, I think really in the last decade particularly, now a lot of the assumptions about religious liberty are under attack. I mean, just even think back to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was bipartisan during the Clinton administration, had virtually unanimous support in Congress. And now almost everything in that would be controversial, very divisive. And I think part of what has changed there is an understanding of the place of religion in American life. And I don't think Christians and maybe other people who value religious liberty have figured out yet a very good way for explaining, no, this is important to everyone. Everyone needs to have their religious conscience. Even if your conviction is that you should be an atheist, you should have within our democracy the freedom of your conscience. And one of the reasons that Christians, I think, ought to agree with that principle is we fundamentally believe that Christianity should be non-coercive. Of course, there are examples in history where Christianity has been practiced in coercive ways. But fundamentally, it's the freedom of the individual and the freedom of the individual conscience before God. I don't think we've really figured out how to articulate that in a way that secular people as well as religious people can say, yes, that should be a value for all of us. I don't think we've learned how to articulate that.
Okay, so this is fun. So the history, one way of thinking about the history of religious liberty in America was that it was Christians, not only the majority population, but the vast, 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 vast majority being generous to a conjured up alternative religious population. So for example, in this great book by Denise Spelling called Thomas Jefferson's Quran, the founders, Franklin, Jefferson, Washington, etc., use the idea of Muslims, although they don't think they've met any, they have because probably a quarter of their slaves were Muslim, right? But they don't think they have met anybody, but they use the imagined Muslim as the far end parameter for their experiment on religious liberty. And they basically say, could we even have a nation with Muslims? And they theoretically say yes. So the point that I'm making is, for much of American history, religious liberty was the vast majority dominant population saying, you can be here too. And when demographics and cultural trends shift a little bit, it just makes things more complicated. And now it might feel like Christians are in the position of defending their own identity as opposed to a universal principle whose proximate application is for other people.
Yeah, right. So I strongly agree with that. So, and I think you can make a very good case. The reason we have religious liberty in the United States is because Christians believe that we should have religious liberty. And that's not the only reason, but that's a strong part of it. Evangelicals get a little queasy when we start appealing to Jefferson and Franklin, just so you know, because they're some of the least evangelical. So they're, in some ways, they're least reliable on some of these topics.
That doesn't mean they're not important.
No, I agree. But they're not the only ones. I mean, I think there are other, very strong voices for religious liberty and appealing to Islam and Judaism also to some degree. And so what's interesting, so that was, as you say, very theoretical almost, because there weren't, that wasn't a strong part of American identity at that time to have these other religious groups. The problem now is, even though we've been insisting on that for 400 years, or at least 300 years, now it seems very self-serving to say, right, we need this and we need to protect this. And I think part of the way we need to articulate it is that it is for the common good. It's good for everyone. So, yep.
And just to say, there's several really important Christian examples, including evangelical examples, yep, of evangelicals basically doing what the authors of the Flushing Remonstrance did, which is to stand up for people who are not like them. There are many, many of those, including the case that recently took place, I believe in Alabama, where a death row inmate requests an imam to be present at his execution. The prison says no. The Supreme Court agrees with the prison, and an evangelical writer writes into the New York Times saying this is egregious, right? Like he should have his own clergy person present for this terrible moment.
It's interesting. We had Arthur Brooks spoke to the college presidents last week, and one of the comments he was making really relates to this. He said, courage is not standing up for yourself in the face of opposition. It's actually standing up for your neighbor in the face of opposition in just that kind of way. I'm casting one eye at the clock. We've got about 10 minutes. Let me ask you this question. This is something we've talked about a little bit. What are some of the, you've mentioned a couple situations you can imagine an evangelical student getting into out in the world after Wheaton, maybe in a medical context, maybe in a classroom context. What are some things you think Wheaton College graduates should be thinking about as they think about how to live out their authentic Christian convictions in professional contexts, just in society? What are things that you, just from your perspective, what you see, you think these are things evangelical young people should really be thinking about in living out their faith?
So I love thought experiments, right? So I love what are some kind of typical situations that you might find yourself in a personal or a professional context where religious diversity is a fraught experience. So here's one that I think about in a personal sense. A couple years back, so we had an evangelical babysitter, somebody that we loved, and my wife and I are going to dinner, and I'm like, my kids are probably 9 and 6 at the time or something like that. We're like, make sure they eat their pizza and green beans, and they say their prayers before bed, right? So, I don't believe in original sin, but my kids don't really like saying their prayers before bed, right? So maybe there's something to this original sin thing that you all have.
Maybe that might be a good thing for us to talk about. We don't have time for that now, but
first step on the glorious road, right? So I have this thought in my head, right? I kind of expect the babysitter to put her foot down on the green beans thing. Eat all your green beans. Do I expect my evangelical babysitter to say, no, you have to say your Muslim prayers? I mean, I would expect her to say it like once or your parents want you to say your prayers. But this is a really interesting conundrum, right? How much do I expect you, 22-year-old, wonderful, smart, warm, responsible babysitter, to be like, your parents want you to say your Muslim prayers? I think that's a really interesting, super everyday situation.
Let's relate that to evangelism. And I think your Martin Luther King Jr. example was interesting that way, because you were pointing out he's learning from his liberal education and from his interest in religious studies, learning some things, convictions, principles from other religions. But he's also saying that is not how we address God. We know God through Jesus Christ. And he's inviting people in his congregation to commit their lives to Christ, come under his lordship, not just as Savior, but also as God. And of course, these are distinctive Christian beliefs that other religions would not hold. You also know, I mean, from hanging out with us evangelicals, we're evangelistic about our faith, and we want to give other people opportunities to come to know Jesus Christ in this way. What advice do you have for Christians who want to share their evangelical faith? What are some pitfalls you see for evangelicals in sharing their faith? Any counsel on evangelism?
Yeah, so number one, I think I have the highest respect for communities that seek to share their faith, right? It is a part of who you are. I have great respect for it. How does any religion grow except to tell its story and to invite other people into it? And at different points in time in different communities, we'll emphasize that in different ways. It's a distinctive part of who evangelicals are. I don't even just respect it from a distance. I admire it. I admire it, right? So that's number one. Number two, my friend Nick Price, IFYC alum, reminds me a lot of my man Kevin Singer over there, who's one of your alum here. He once told me, look, in the Bible, there's the Great Commission and there's the Great Cooperation, right? So there is a command to spread the gospel and there's a command to cooperate, to be a good neighbor. And the question is, when do you do which one? And I think that that's really the question. And the truth of the matter is, y'all are already really good at this. And the reason is because you have built organizations like World Vision, which work around the world and which hire people from all kinds of different faiths and that are saving people's lives in medical contexts and social service contexts and disaster relief contexts all around the world. And you do that because you're Christian. And my sense is that there is something of a firewall between those kinds of we serve because we are Christian categories and the now we're in evangelism mode, right? And so I have high respect for that. And I would just say to make sure that you're paying attention to that, right? So if you're an oncologist and there is somebody who is like, this is it as far as a surgery goes, that's that's the time to witness to your Christian faith. It's the best kind of doctor you can be, right? And that is a Christian witness. That service is a Christian witness. And the evangelical, the invitation to Jesus Christ probably happens in a different time, place, and mode.
So I'm interested, you, Interfaith Youth Corps, we saw some examples in the PBS. You have student conferences, students from a lot of different religions are engaging with one another. I'm guessing that on a percentage basis, you have fewer evangelical students in those dialogues than other religions. And I'm wondering what you think some of the reasons for that are. And then I know you've had some of our Wheaton students very strong in their Christian commitments, not compromising anything, but also I think you've had the experience very generous in their engagement with other people. And I'm wondering what you think some of the dispositions that evangelicals could bring to those principled dialogues, disagreements, and also areas of cooperation. Am I reading the situation right?
Yeah,
What's your perspective on it?
So I would say at IFYC right now, we generally speaking, we're kind of a cross-section of four-year residential higher education, I would say. So probably 25% of the people involved in our work are atheists, agnostics, secular humanists of some variety. We're probably overrepresented in Muslims in part because there's only 1% of Muslims in the general population. There's probably 5 or 10% in IFYC programs, 5 or 10% Jews, probably 5 or 10% evangelicals would be my wild guess, a lot of mainline Protestants, and kind of liberal Catholics. I would love to see more evangelicals, more conservative Catholics, more traditionalist Muslims, more members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I personally have very, very high regard for what Brian McLaren calls a generous orthodoxy, right? A lot of my mentors are those people like Sheikh Hamza Youssef. Even though I am not a particularly orthodox person myself, I have high regard for people who view their fidelity to the tradition as the highest commitment that they have, and their role in the continuity of that tradition and its identity community as a very, very high commitment. And I don't think we have enough of that at IFYC.
So one of the things that you do, Eboo, is you're really a student of some of these other religions. It's sort of an ongoing educational process, just to work, cooperate, these different college campuses. What have been some of the things that have surprised you about evangelicals over the years as you've gotten to know our community better?
Look, honestly, because of my friendships at Glenbard South, because of the house I grew up in, right? Like parents, especially a mom, is extremely committed to a particular path, is the path of truth. I'll tell you a hilarious story. I hope this is okay with my mom for telling.
I always love it when somebody says, "I hope this is okay." I know, like
with her
you've
mother,
got my attention
with his mother.
now.
So I'm at Wheaton Academy. Right?
Yeah, right, where my kids go to school now. Right.
So my older son plays travel basketball, is 11 years old, and Wheaton Academy is where he has his tournament on Saturday. And as I'm there, I get an email from President Ryken. And so I email back, I'm like, I'm at Wheaton Academy. This has to be a feeder school for Wheaton College, right? It's like, there's like God stuff everywhere, right? And he's like, yes, my son plays basketball there. Well, we get about a dozen students there every year. So my mom comes to watch Zaid's basketball game. And she's like, I've been saying the Fatiha more and more for protection, which is the first surah, first chapter in the Quran. And she's like, I say it, and then I recite the meaning. And I'm like, that's great. And I'm like, look, Zaid has the ball on the left wing. And my mom says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'm like, oh, he made a great pass to the top of the key. Alhamdulillah ar-Rabbil Alameen. Look, he's driving the lane. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'm like, Mom, So in Wheaton Academy, as I'm trying to explain the game of basketball to my mom, she's like reciting the Fatiha to me in between play calling, right? And I'm thinking to myself, like, this is my mom who's like extremely devoted to this tradition and so generous in her respect for other traditions. And it doesn't take away her devotion, right? And in fact, there's like a connection. And I get the sense of like, like the songs you sing at YMCA campfires, right? Like you are filled with the sense of gratitude that comes from God, and you want to pass it on. And part of what it means is like you just exude this warmth. And honestly, like I grew up with religion as warmth. I grew up with a loving religious family who at Notre Dame football games would stop at the grotto, cup our hands in prayer, close our eyes, and I'd be like, what are we doing? You know, praying in front of a Catholic shrine. And my dad would say, the Quran says that God is light upon light. Look at all the candles, right? So it doesn't surprise me, right? I think the warmth in religious people doesn't surprise me. What surprises me is when people want to conjure monsters of people that they haven't met. And that I'm just like, why would you do that? Right? Like that is against the will of God. We are meant to be witnesses we are meant to lift people up, to acknowledge the image of God within them, for Muslims, the breath of God within them. That is what we do.
As David Capes comes up to give us a couple of final announcements, will you please join me in thanking Eboo Patel for being here at Wheaton College tonight?
Thanks, man.
Thanks as well to Dr. Ryken for being an inquisitor, asking good questions, but also a good conversation partner. We have guests today from outside Wheaton College who are with us, as you may have known, from the community, from the city, from the Turkish American Society in Wheaton, from Interfaith Youth Corps, and other places. Kevin Singer, who is a graduate of this great institution, runs an organization called Neighborly Faith. And I want to thank him for his assistance this evening as well. If you want more information, if you would like to connect with other Wheaton students who are interested in this conversation, we're going to invite you to come over here for about 5 minutes after we meet to talk with Anna Cole and Tim Banna about what's next. You ask a great question. Now, what's next? After Judeo-Christian, what's next? And I think it's really up to us to sort of figure that out. The Stories That Shape Us will happen in September of 2019 with Rabbi Stephen Bob. I want to thank you for being a part of this. Please, in my tradition, we ask you to greet one another with a holy kiss, but a holy handshake's okay as well. So greet one another on the way out. You may find people of other faith sitting right next to you. God bless. Good night.